Welcome, everybody. We're so glad you all could join us for our Demystifying Trust-Based Philanthropy session. What does evaluation look like in a trust-based context? My name is Shantia Ford, and I'm the Director of Programs here at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. As a visual descriptor, I am a Black woman in a purple dress with my lucky red lip on, and I'm sitting in front of a white background with some artwork and diplomas behind me. As my land acknowledgement, I'm currently residing on Lenape Native land, also known as Philadelphia. And we're just so glad to have you all here with us today. Thank you so much for being here. So a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into things. Of course, we ask that you keep your microphones muted. We encourage you to use the chat box for your questions, comments, any dialogue. Feel free to introduce yourself, connect with others there. We also encourage you to use the most recent version of Zoom for all of its capabilities. We have accessibility. There's a CART transcription available. Live transcription is available for this event. To enable live captioning, navigate to the meeting's control toolbar and click the show captions icon. This session will be recorded for future reference. It'll be available on our website. And we encourage you to join us on social media using the hashtag DemystifyingTBP for all of your insights, your thoughts, your lessons learned, and the shifts you're going to make from what you've heard. Of course, I have to give a shout out to the amazing Trust-Based Philanthropy Project staff. This is an all hands on deck event. And so we're all here. We'll be in the chat here to support you. If you have any questions, if you need anything, these are the folks to ask. So thank you all to the staff. To get into our series outline, we are in session 5 of 6. This has flown by. You see the previous ones, I'm not going to go into detail with those, but if you missed any or want to go back and look at the recordings, those are available on our website. We encourage you to check those out. And today's session, of course, is around evaluation. What does that look like in a trust-based context? And we also encourage you to come back for our final session in the series on August 2nd around racial equity. What does racial equity have to do with trust-based philanthropy? So for today's agenda, we'll have our opening, the grounding context, just to ground everybody and situate everybody. We'll have an amazing panel discussion. We're so excited to hear from our panelists. And then we'll have some time at the end for discussion. The discussion is open to everybody, so please stick around for that. We have some amazing philanthropy serving organization, PSO partners, who will be hosting breakout discussions. If you're a member, if you're not a member, but you're in their area or interested in learning more about their work or connecting with their members, we encourage you to join their breakout room. We'll also have space in the main breakout at the end if you just want to have general questions, but encourage you to join those breakout rooms. So I just want to jump in. I'm going to give a very, very brief overview of trust-based philanthropy. If you are completely new to trust-based philanthropy, we encourage you to check out our website, check out our resources, ask questions, engage, but we won't be spending too much time on that grounding today because we want to jump right into the materials. But it's important to understand that trust-based philanthropy is a values-driven approach that really seeks to address the inherent power imbalances between funders, nonprofits, and the communities they're aiming to serve. So there is a current power imbalance. And so trust-based philanthropy really seeks to help funders shift the way they're working and operating to be more relational and to reduce the power imbalances. And so we encourage this through assessing your values, having a values-driven approach to everything you do. And so you'll see the 4 dimensions of trust-based philanthropy here: culture, structures, practices, and leadership. And your values should be ingrained in all of these aspects of your work. And so we encourage you to check that out more. We have a wonderful resource on the 4 dimensions of trust-based philanthropy. We also have great resources on the practices, all of these different dimensions, and all of this work. But for now, we're going to jump right into things and kick it off with an opening poll. I know we're all situated in different aspects of the work and different roles, different perspectives. And so we love to start off with the question, how confident are you that you can answer this question? What does evaluation look like in a trust-based context? We know people are coming in from different levels, different perspectives, and we designed this programming, we've designed the series to really acknowledge some of those common questions that we get. And this is one of those common questions. So we love to hear where you're sitting as you're coming into this room with that. And we're seeing, thank you for those of you that have completed the poll. I'll just wait just a second longer before closing it. For the most part, people are somewhat confident, and a good amount are not confident at all, and that's perfectly fine. Hopefully after this session, you'll have deeper understanding of how to answer that. So I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll and share those results. As we can see, about 58% are somewhat confident and about 36% are not confident at all. And then we have 5% that are very confident, and we're excited to have you. Feel free to share as we learn together in the chat and in our discussions afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the grounding context. What does evaluation look like in a trust-based context? Again, as I mentioned, we tailor these session titles around common questions and misperceptions we see and we hear as we're talking to funders. And this one really gets at that assumption that a trust-based approach really makes measuring impact more difficult or not possible at all. And it really assumes that practices such as restricted funding or in-depth applications or lengthy reporting, all of those different processes lead to better impact measurement. And we encourage you to really flip the script on that and question, okay, if I'm offering restricted funding, does that really mean I'm able to track and measure my impact better? So you'll hear some amazing stories from our panelists about why that assumption is not true and how you can shift that and how you can have rigorous evaluation practice in a trust-based approach. And so that if you don't take away anything else, just know and understand that there is a rigor to this. There is a way to understand this in a deep and impactful way, and understand that social sector movement is complex, and we're not encouraging folks to just throw out everything and just give the money away. There are ways to measure that. But before we jump into that, I do want to give a bit of grounding and distinctions around the definitions, the way we define and identify these things. We use these terms interchangeably, and I also want to set the context and just say that each funding institution is different in the ways you're utilizing these methods and the ways you're defining them. We talk about reporting as those periodic updates. Maybe you have a mid-year report, an end of grant report that really get at the financial status of things, the programmatic status, maybe your organizational health, different metrics for where you've gone, that progress during a grant life cycle. The monitoring side of things really is that collection of grant progress, is tracking those milestones against the expectations oftentimes that are funder set for purposes of compliance. And we really try to shift and encourage folks to really think about what it means to monitor a nonprofit and why that's something you should probably shift away from, as it really centers the idea of compliance and regulation. And when we're shifting to a more trust-based approach, we're really thinking about how to be in relationship with them rather than hoarding power over them, so to speak. And then evaluation is that data-driven assessment of the impact progression to address those more strategic, bigger questions, long-term impact, those things we think about, the theories of change, the logic models, those types of things. And of course, this is just an overview. We could go into a whole session just on these definitions and the ways folks are actually implementing this work. So a trust-based learning approach really shifts from that compliance, monitoring, and the proving-based reporting, saying, you're going to make your grantees prove what they've done, how they've done it, what it looks like. And it shifts from that mindset and that way of operating to collaborative learning. And collaborative learning about barriers and accelerators to advancing impact. There are so many different ways to really look at collaborative learning and think about the ways you're learning as a funder and the ways you're learning with your grantee partners and with the community. And I know oftentimes we frame learning as this soft and unfocused way of operating and being, but the learning process can be rigorous and should be rigorous in and of itself. And it can really help funders to have a better understanding of how to be a better and more strategic funder. And so that's what we're encouraging here in this work. So a trust-based evaluation approach really shifts those learning and impact priorities from being funder-centric to being community-centric. So we think about those funder-defined metrics and the funders identifying what success looks like and putting that on their grantees, to that one-way accountability. How are grantees accountable to funders and not vice versa? And we talked about that in the last session. If you didn't check that out, you can check out that recording. And then that proving stance, grantees having to prove what they've done, how they did it, how they're working towards impact. And it shifts to that community-centric approach, thinking about those collaboratively developed metrics. How can you and your grantees sit down together and really think about what does success look like for our engagement together? It's that mutual accountability that we talked about previously. How are the funders accountable to the grantees and the communities just as much as they're accountable to each other? And then it's values driven. You're really looking at what evaluation looks like from a values driven approach and embedding your values into everything that you're doing in this process. So that values-based approach to evaluation really holds us accountable to our values. It helps us to learn about our work in order to improve and refine and make better future decisions. And it helps us to understand that bigger picture and the collective process within or progress within that ecosystem in which we operate. So we encourage you to consider some alternative ways to capture learning for a lot of different reasons. Of course, to reduce grantee burden, to demonstrate trust, that you trust your grantees and that you trust their leadership, and to come at it with a humble approach, full of humility, to build those stronger, deeper relationships, to be relationship-centric, to understand the social movement is complex, and it helps you to understand that bigger picture of the issues, and to understand and to listen for ways to support those grantees' impact goals. And how you can do it, there are so many different ways. You'll hear 3 distinct stories of ways that funders are doing it just in this presentation, but really to put the onus on funder staff. Think about ways that you can, you and your team, your organization can do the homework and can support your grantees. Maybe it's you're doing the write-ups for your reporting rather than requiring it for them, having that conversation, and then you taking the notes, or you as a funder, putting the onus of the work on the funder staff rather than your grantee partners. Also, there are a lot of different funders out here that are reducing and eliminating narrative reporting requirements. We encourage you to consider what's not necessary, what you're not using to make decisions or to move forward, what you're just requiring your grantee partners to do without holding those conversations with them and without learning from what you're doing. We encourage you to implement alternative methods. Plenty of funders are doing that, such as oral reporting, having those calls, having focus groups, having videos, allowing them to send in something that they've sent to another funder organization, all sorts of different ways that you can really shift this to still capture rigorous learnings. Recognizing the value of stories, that qualitative data is just so valuable, and you can still report out on that, you can still learn from that. And then of course, checking for understanding and alignment. So with everything that you're writing as a funder, everything that you're reporting out on, making sure that you're going back to the grantees, back to the community, and making sure that there is that alignment, that you're understanding it correctly and that you're reporting it correctly. So that's just a great way to be more trust-based in your approaches. And just to lift this up, we do have an amazing resource that really gets at what trust-based evaluation could look like. These 3 focal points for learning for accountability, learning for decision-making, and learning for long-term impact. And I'm not going to speak too much on this right now because you'll get to hear all about this from one of our panelists, but this is just one of the ways that you can really look at being more trust-based in the way that you are conducting evaluation. And so with that, I do want to jump into our panel discussion. I'm so excited for this conversation. We have Brenda Solorzano, the CEO of the Headwaters Foundation. We have Sarah Walczek, the Executive Director of Satterberg Foundation. And we have Sherry Turitz, the Vice President for Program at the American Jewish World Service. And our esteemed leader, Shadi Salehi, will be leading this discussion with these amazing panelists. And I will pass it off to you, Shadi.
Thank you so much, Shantius. That was an amazing grounding and overview in a record amount of time. There's so much to say about this topic, and we wanted to offer some quick grounding before we could hear directly from our leaders today. So we want to make as much time as possible for this conversation. We invite you all to pose your questions in the chat as you hear from our panelists, and we will do our best to incorporate those questions in the chat. Know that we have over 500 people on today, so we will not be able to get to every question. However, we encourage you, especially those of you who are already somewhat familiar with what we're talking about today, to bring additional questions and thoughts into your breakout discussions after this panel. Okay, so hello, everyone. I'm Shadi Salehi. I'm the Executive Director of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. I'm an Iranian woman with olive skin and long brown hair and a geometric patterned shirt and a blurred background, joining you from Ohlone land, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area, and very happy to be with you all today. So I'd love to just get us started by introducing our amazing panelists and have each of you share a little bit, just a little bit of context about your respective grant-making organizations, just so we know kind of the context, the size, the grant-making budget, just some of those grounding things to help people understand your context. And then start us off, after you share that, share about kind of your philosophy to learning and evaluation, and what do you see as the purpose behind learning and evaluation? Because so much of what we're talking about here and some of that grounding that Shantius offered is really suggesting a real paradigm shift in how we have conventionally looked at evaluation in philanthropy. So I'd love for the 3 of you to reflect on that a little bit more just from your stance. So Brenda Solorzano, let's start with you, CEO of Headwaters Foundation. Share with us a little bit about your work and your philosophy to learning and evaluation.
Thank you, Shadi, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a delight to be with all of you to have this important conversation. I am a Latina woman with short hair, olive skin, sitting in an office with a bookcase and a bunch of little gadgets in the background. I am sitting on the land of the Salish, Kootenai, and Ponderay people, otherwise known as Missoula, Montana. Headwaters is a health conversion foundation, and we are a foundation that has been around for a little over 6 years. We have almost 400 grantees. We give out somewhere between $4 and $6 million a year and focused on Western Montana. One of the things that I think I really want people to know is that we consider ourselves a strategic funder, not just a trust-based funder. We are interested in supporting systems change efforts to address social determinants of health in Western Montana. We are very interested in seeing impact and improvement of health outcomes for children and families, especially those that are below the 200% of the federal poverty level. And the reason I say that is that oftentimes people think that trust-based funders just are writing grants and don't really care about the impact. And nothing could be farther from the truth in terms of how we think about our work here at Headwaters. In terms of our philosophy, I think one of the things that I have learned in my over 25 years now in philanthropy is that we have been focused so much on evaluation to demonstrate the impact that the foundation has had, as opposed to really understanding what's working and what's not working and is necessary for social change work. The other thing that I've recognized is that we try to apply ROI type of evaluation practices to social change work. And I don't believe that that actually has allowed us to understand what really is happening in the work that we're supporting as a field out in the community. And I think it's fed into that power dynamic of foundations determining success, measuring and evaluating nonprofits, and holding the power in the approach. And my philosophy and the philosophy of Headwaters has been, what if we turn that paradigm around? And what if we actually began to build a learning culture so that we could understand what is happening as a result of the resources that we're putting out into the community, what's working, what's not working. And not only for the foundation and the board, which in many times is often the audience for evaluation, but rather for our grantees and the communities and the fields we work in, so that they can actually take advantage of the information and resources that we have been able to gather as a result of really prioritizing learning work. So that's our philosophy, is thinking about it very differently. And I think Chantel already gave an overview, and what she described is exactly what helps inform and drive our work at Headwaters. The other thing that I want to share before we jump off to our next wonderful panelist is that learning for us is a core part of everything we do. We do learning at the staff level, we do learning at the board level, at the grantee level, and learning is embedded in everything. It's in our budget, so we have a learning item. It's part of our performance review of our staff. It is something that we incorporate into all of our agendas. So it's not just, we have a learning team over here and they do the learning work. It is embedded in everything that we do. And I think that's really important to understand, that if you don't actually do that, you're really going to have a disconnect between the people that are on the program side and the people that are doing the learning work. I'll stop there and pass it back to you, Shadi.
And well, thank you so much, Brenda, for that really clear overview. We will have an opportunity to hear more in depth about how that's been operationalized at Headwaters. So I'm sure you all have questions and we will come back to Brenda. But I want to pick up on this thread that you noted, Brenda, about this is really a cultural approach. And we often lift up embracing learning as one of the core values of a trust-based approach. And there are many ways that this manifests in the way an organization can embed that learning approach. So Sarah, I want to come to you next. Sarah Walczyk, Executive Director of the Satterberg Foundation. Can you share with us your funding focus and grant-making budget and how you approach your philosophy to learning and evaluation at Satterberg?
Yeah, excited to be here. Again, I'm Sarah Walczyk. I currently serve as the Executive Director at the Satterberg Foundation. My visual descriptor is I'm a middle-aged white woman. I have blonde highlighted hair, shoulder length. I'm wearing black and gold rimmed glasses and a striped button-up shirt. I'm currently sitting at my desk with windows in the background, and it looks pretty clean, I think. I'm also here in our offices, which are in downtown Seattle, which is resides on the unceded ancestral home of the Coast Salish peoples. And the Satterberg Family Foundation was founded in 1991 by a mother of 6 siblings. Those 6 original siblings were the foundation of our board. And today we have 9 family board members and 8 staff. Our mission is quite broad, which is to strengthen our communities by promoting a just society and sustainable environment. And the third prong of the mission is to doing this work deepens the interconnection of the family, because we are a family foundation. Broadly, this means we seek a world in balance between people and environment. And so that is an expansive mission to hold. We have annual grant making that exceeds about 45 million. We have close to 400 grantee partners. We fund primarily in 3 states where our family members reside, which would be Washington, California, and Arizona. And in 2020, we launched a national grant making strategy. So we are kind of all over the place. That being said, when we look at a just society and sustainable environment, those elements do allow us to reflect on the work that we are funding. But more holistically, we have to take a broader approach to being accountable to our grantees. So as a family foundation, we're rooted in the family's values, we're rooted in Sadaver's values, and we're able to be reflective on, are we living up to our values? Are we being accountable? Are those values showing up in our grant making? And that learning frame sort of allows us to understand from our grantees' perspective if we are living up to how we see our role as a funder. And so are we saying, as a leader and I think a supporter of trust-based philanthropy, are our grantees saying that we are living up to that? So we do that piece very well. And then more holistically, I think Sadaver is able to listen in intently to the needs of nonprofits now nationally. And from that, we're able to take the challenges from those organizations more broadly to inform how we can show up and fund the needs, the things that Shantias is talking about, to accelerate grants and fund ecosystem things, or even figure out how to remove barriers. And so I think it's an accountability approach to learning. And along with Brenda, lifelong learning is a value of the foundation. So it shows up in every single thing that we do. The reflection and learning process is one that's engaged throughout our work programmatically, the board's work, the staff's. And so it allows us to be able to be a reflective organization. I would say the lifelong learning commitment means that we are in a lot of open-ended, ongoing conversations. For 10 years that I've been at the foundation, I often make a joke of, I feel like I've been in a 10-year sense-making synthesis conversation. And I think that's how we show the impact. And we know, we are making an impact by being a multi-year general operating funder. We have funded now organizations for 8 years, and we can collectively reflect on that over time. And I would say, as stewards of resources, making an impact is very important to the family. So it is something we are constantly being accountable to.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that wonderful overview and emphasizing what it looks like to build in a learning culture, and also demonstrating, like what Brenda was saying, this shift away from this kind of conventional look at return on investment, needing to have 12-month metrics, and taking a more expansive look, and reinforcing the value of having multi-year relationships with partners, because that allows for funders to really understand change over time. So now coming to you, Sherry Turitz, Vice President of Programs at American Jewish World Service. You are funding at a global level with hundreds of grantees around the world. So you can hear in our different panelists, there's different regional perspectives being brought here in terms of focus of funding. Share with us, Sherry, how your general kind of context of your grant making focus, and how you all at HAWS approach your philosophy to learning and evaluation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shadi. Thank you, Shantias, and my esteemed colleagues on the panel. This is such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I am Sherry Turitz. I am also a white middle-aged woman with long dark hair. I'm wearing orange rimmed glasses. I have a window behind me and I'm sitting in my office. And I am located in New York on the territory, Lenape territory. So it is a real pleasure to be here with all of you all. As the Vice President for Programs here at HAWS, my role is really to oversee all of our grant making, accompaniment, which is what we used to call our capacity strengthening work, and our advocacy work as well. And we do all of this programmatic work in deep partnership with our Strategic Learning Research and Evaluation Division, which is actually a separate division from the Programs Division, but very much works in partnership with programs. So a little bit about HAWS. We were founded as a public charity about 38 years ago. We are a grassrooted social movements funder and advocate, and our overall goal is to support marginalized people in the global South to realize their human rights. That work takes place across 17 countries. As Shadi says, we're a global funder in Asia, Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean. We focus on 4 broad human rights issue areas: sexual health and rights, which focuses on LGBTQI communities, women and adolescent girls. Secondly, climate justice, which is focused very strongly on land and water rights. Civil and political rights, which focuses on supporting processes of democracy and justice. And lastly, humanitarian response, also in a human rights approach where we respond to natural and climate-induced disasters. So we have about 540 grantee partners. We grant about $18 million per year to approximately 38 social movements, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Our staff includes 31 in-country colleagues, which is really, in many ways, the cornerstone of some of our trust-based practices. And these are the folks who really lead our grantee accompaniment work and due diligence work in country. And we also have a US policy and Jewish engagement team in Washington that works hand in hand with our grant-making team to push for progressive US foreign policy that's aligned with the goals of the movements we're supporting in the field. So the second question is, why do we do an evaluation? What is the purpose of that? And really the primary purpose of our evaluation system here at AJWS is to support the program staff and our grantees that are operating in incredibly complex and difficult environments to make the best decisions that they can. So by understanding whether and how our strategies are effective, we feel like we can make more informed decisions about how to direct our resources and strengthen those strategies to meet overall goals. So we really see evaluation here at AJWS as a central pillar in our commitment to that continued learning and improvement. As my colleagues also spoke to, we very much have built a culture of learning here at AJWS, and we also invest in that quite a bit. And we see this learning work as our way to maximize our effectiveness and, of course, improve our impact. And we actually believe that is our ethical obligation, first and foremost, to the marginalized community members and movements that we're partnering with to do this work. And of course, it also supports our ability to ensure our donors to AJWS that we are stewarding their resources to maximum impact and effect. So I would say at the highest level, that's why we do this work.
Brilliant. So you all are probably hearing some themes in how Brenda, Sarah, and Sherry are describing their philosophies. And it really reinforces that shift away from that proving stance toward really supporting those who are leading the work and being better informed at being strategic and impactful funders. So the common denominator here is a real desire to see impact and a humility in recognizing that advancing impact is not like a straight line from A to B. There's a lot of variables that come into play. And so we're already getting a lot of questions about the how. So how do you do it? So we're going to dig into it now. And so we're going to come back in the same order we went. And so Brenda, coming to you, you've articulated this 3-pronged or kind of 3 focal areas of learning for how you approach that at Headwaters. Can you tell us more about those 3 focal areas and how you have operationalized that at Headwaters Foundation?
Yes, I'm happy to share more about that. But before I do get into the details of the 3-prong approach, I just want to call out a couple of different things that are part of what has allowed us to operationalize this 3-prong approach. The first is we have done the work in listening to community and defining what is the strategy, the impact that the community wants to see and have Headwaters support. So we have gone through a community-informed driven process to develop a very strategic approach to our work. And we can't do the way that we do evaluation if we hadn't done that at the front end of our work. Specific things that I want to call out about that is that it has allowed us, or we have made a code definition of success with our grantees, similar to what has already been described. We have shifted the burden from having our grantees submit grant reports to our staff, collecting information and data and entering it into our knowledge management system. And we have also made a very public commitment to sharing this information externally. And so our learning book, I put in the chat, is also available on our website, and I'll have one of my colleagues put in the link to that learning book. And I think it's important to say all these things, because then it makes what I'm going to share in terms of the three-prong approach make more sense. The other thing I'll share is that the three-prong approach comes from years of me doing evaluation at a variety of different foundations over my previous tenure at 4 other different foundations before I got to Headwaters. And a realization that at many of the foundations I was at, we were trying to do this direct correlation, as Shadi said, from our $200,000 grant to ending hunger in communities in 2 years, which is like ridiculous, right? When you think about that's not how it works. Social change is far more complex. There are so many different players. We do not control in philanthropy what's going to change. There's so many different things that come into play. And so it requires a reimagination of how then do we understand what is happening as a result of the resources that we are putting into nonprofits and into community to try to achieve social change. And from that came this three-prong approach. And the three-prong approach is that there are 3 different ways to think about learning and evaluation. And I always lead with learning as opposed to evaluation, again, because the evaluation is too focused from my perspective on ROI and foundations being in charge, as opposed to really the learning frame. The first prong is the idea of accountability, which we always use accountability of our grantees, but we very rarely turn the lens on ourselves and say, how are we being accountable to the communities that we serve? Are we actually living the values that we say we are living? Are we trust-based? Are we transparent? Are we really sharing power? How do we give grantees an opportunity to give us feedback about how we're doing, whether that's through a grantee perception report or through some other mechanism to collect feedback and information? That's an important part of the work that we do at Headwaters. And I think it has to be an important part of how you put together an evaluation and learning practice at any foundation, because otherwise you're not actually doing a comprehensive evaluation approach. So that accountability piece is really important. The second part of our learning approach is learning to understand programmatic impact around what is working and what is not working in the things that we are investing in the communities and the organizations that we're supporting. This actually is an important part of our work, but we're wanting to understand it in the context of not individual grants, but rather the ecosystems that we work in. So for example, at Headwaters, we're very interested in supporting shifts and changes and improvements on early childhood. So when we think about the second prong of evaluation, we're really looking at the early childhood ecosystem. We're not necessarily looking at an individual grant or an individual organization. We also are not only looking at it in the context of our grant making, we're looking at it from what's happening in the legislature, what is happening among other funders, what is happening with other adjacent issues, so that it's a more comprehensive approach to understand what is happening in the areas that we work in the communities that we work with. And again, it doesn't come from grantee reports. It comes from our staff being out there, reading, engaging, participating, collecting all that information, bringing it back and entering it into our knowledge management system. And our knowledge management system was built out in alignment with the outcomes that our grantees defined as these are the outcomes. So that's the second portion of it. And it's really probably the most labor intensive, but the one that actually provides some real interesting information for our staff and our board and our grantee partners. The third area of evaluation in this three-prong approach is what I describe as tracking long-term health indicators. And I think this is where philanthropy has wanted to focus on, right? What are the needles that are moving around specific targeted indicators? But we have historically looked at those indicators in very short term, and we have also looked at it only by the grants that we support. And I think that, as I said in the beginning, this change is far more complex than to be able to do that linear match. That said, I think it is important for us as a field to understand what is working and not working, what needles are moving, and if they're not moving, why aren't they moving? and explore those conversations as opposed to really trying to get grantees to prove whether or not they're moving the needles. So that's the three-prong approach. The other thing that I want to share with everyone is that this three-prong approach requires us to look at each of those prongs at different intervals. So the first level that we look at, that accountability piece, these are things we control. These are the way that we do our work. This is the way we partner and build relationships. We know that on a more real-time basis, whether or not, or we can measure it in a more real-time basis about whether or not we're meeting those expectations. So we can look at that at that level of indicators and report on it on a quarterly basis, which we actually do. The second level of learning in our three-prong approach is this programmatic one. Well, reality is that in these ecosystems of social change, we're not going to see shifts in 1 month, 2 month, 3 month increments. At a minimum, you want to be looking at it on a yearly basis, which is what we do. So that means that we actually produce a segment in our learning book that is about this learning for programmatic impact and understanding every year. And then the long-term indicators, which is a third prong, we actually don't expect that we're going to improve the early childhood system in 1 year or 2 years or 4 years. It's probably more realistically to think about it every 5 years, every 10 years. So that gives you a different way to be organizing your work. You can do your quarterly work, your yearly work, and then we look at our long-term indicators every time we're revisiting our strategic framework, which is right now is a 5-year framework. So every 5 years we look at that. And then we create this learning book, which I said is available on our website. And this learning book becomes the tool, an ongoing tool that we use to inform learning conversations at the staff level. So we have monthly learning conversations. We also use the learning book to inform strategic board learning conversations. And from it, we have also identified learning conversations that we want to engage with our grantee partners. So it's not just the tool to report on at the board meeting. It's not just a scorecard that makes our board chair happy. It is a useful tool that we incorporate and that we look at every quarter on accountability, every year on programmatic, and every 5 years on the long-term indicators. I'll stop there because that's probably a mouthful.
That's amazing. And again, just kudos to you for being able to distill so much in a short time frame. I want to ask you a follow-up question that's related to something that's coming up in the chat. When you're looking at programmatic indicators, so that second pronged, do you have standard indicators that you're looking for, or how does that work? Because the long-term indicators I understand, but there's a question around the programmatic indicators and how you assess that and track that.
Yeah, and I think this has been an evolution, to be honest with you. So we actually have a theory of change, and we have a series of outcomes that our grantees define for us. And when we are collecting information and we have built out our knowledge management system, it is all aligned to those outcomes that are part of our theory of change. So we can actually go into our knowledge management system and pull out all of the data information that relates to any one particular outcome. And that is how we look at things. One of the things we realized, though, as we were looking at our outcomes that our grantees defined, is that it didn't allow us to look at the ecosystems in the way that I described we look at now. And so now we do two elements to our learning book. We do one that's capturing what we're hearing and learning from the outcomes, which are from our grantees at a high level, all about systems change. But then we have pages in our learning book that are specific to the ecosystems that we work on. So for example, we have a page on early childhood that paints a more comprehensive picture of everything that's happening. So I hope that kind of helps answer that particular question.
That's great. And just a reminder that in the chat, you can find a link to a place where you can download the learning book and you can take a closer look at it. Also, I want to shout out Stephanie Schilling from Headwaters, who is replying to some of the questions, who has a key role in learning and evaluation at Headwaters. So pay attention to her responses in the chat also. Okay, Sarah, moving on to you, really to kind of come back and reinforce the real kind of accountability stance that you've taken at Satterberg. Can you share with us more about how you have operationalized that, particularly around getting feedback and input from your partners in assessing how well you're showing up against your values? Can you share with us more about that and other tools and tactics you've implemented in order to better learn about your work?
Yeah, thank you. I think it was it's always amazing to be in space with Brenda too, like helping remember some of the things that we did too when we launched this core support, a general operating multi-year grant program about 8 years ago. One of the things that led us there was, in fact, these community conversations that the family and staff went through at the time to find out from grantees where the family was most needed in the funding ecosystem at that time. And also, if there are different ways that we could be funding. So that helps me realize that was remembering that was very rooted in where our community saw as a family foundation of how we sort of got here to now, after 5 years into the strategy. I saw that question come up in the chat and I thought, yeah, I remember the early days of asking for direct, honest, transparent feedback from grantees, and we had no trusting relationship with these partners. And so I think it is something that it took us a while to get to, is to build that authentic connection and relationship. And we had to prove our accountability to these organizations as well. And that is on their terms. And so that took some time. And what it allowed us to do, though, then 5 years in, was to hold these insight circles with the evaluation firm, the Headwater Peoples, and they held these circles with our grantees to hold a space, first of all, that was important and safe for them in a style of appreciative inquiry, that then all of these themes would also inform and help us better understand if we thought we were making an impact or if we were showing up in a values-oriented way. And so that report is on our website as well, and I can link to it. But that process, the intentionality that it was designed for, was also allowed for these cohorts of organizations to come together and raise up around if we were actually doing what we said we were doing. And in this space where there's not a lot of accountability on philanthropy, and even in family philanthropy, it was one of the things that the family wanted to do, is we wanted to make sure we're walking the talk. And so this methodology allowed us to get more clarity around where we were going to pivot in the future as well. And so certain themes came out of that report that then the foundation gave itself capacity to respond to. And it allowed us to change some of our practices, and we published it publicly, even with the comments and concerns in there, as another way to be transparent. And so that community-centered approach follows us through the personal evaluation. I will say, we also do the evaluation on our grantee partners with our grants. With those 400 grantees, we have program officers who are responsible for managing those relationships. And the through line through all of that is when we're doing our annual check-ins, which we also eliminated the written report, we have our program officers synthesizing these questions that everyone is getting asked across the board. And those questions allow us to be able to tell us, how has the funding impacted? What are some of the surprises and challenges that have come up? We have priorities within those grant areas around making sure organizations are focused on advocacy and root cause. We ask questions about capacity building. We also ask questions about equity in the organization. And then we keep an open-ended question around, what would you like us to know? And all of those, all of that data comes back to the organization, and then we reflect on it and figure out, is there something we could respond to? Because we are a very responsive organization as well. But it is a holistic view of all of the work that we're doing, and then we can say we're making an impact because, for instance, 78% of them said this long-term multi-year support has allowed them to do ... And it's all about innovation. It's all about being able to slow down and being reflective. It also let us understand, especially inside different parts of the system, folks were really struggling with capacity to pay their staff. So then it allows us to figure out how to prioritize showing up in wage equity spaces. We were hearing a lot of burnout. We invested in sabbatical resources here in our sector. Right now, we're hearing a lot about folks wanting to have land and acquisition ownership of the places they're in. And so then how can we leverage our entire endowment to figure out how to make some of those things happen? So it's a more broad reflection to meeting our nonprofits' needs, but it is intentional, and it's something that the board and staff do collectively. I would say we're at a 10-year mark of where are we going next? And I think some of the things Brenda alluded to around the long-term impact, figuring out how to implement that in a mission to promote a just society and sustainable environment, we're talking about true social change. And so how do we show as a family foundation that we're actually showing up and being part of that ecosystem at large?
Wow, thank you,
Yeah.
Sarah. I have a couple follow-up questions for you around how you've structured that so that it enables space for your team to come together and reflect on learnings. Because with that many grantees, I love the clarity of the consistent questions you're asking every grantee and making space to look for patterns. How do you as a team come together and assess those learnings? What does that look like?
Yeah, and honestly, full transparency, like we're struggling a little bit with the type of foundation that just says yes to everything. And so carving out space, we have weekly meetings, and one now meeting is focused completely on what you just asked me, because we have to be intentional about carving out the time. And then the program staff are meeting separate. But as an organization, everyone is there to kind of help synthesize and sense make it. So those meetings happen. And then on a quarterly basis, we bring those findings to the board. And so this quarter, we are bringing all the findings from California. So we're able to kind of locate them by place too, and then allows us to put in, more context of what's happening outside of that. So I think what you're asking me is just, I know we need more time to do that. And I think when we said the very trust-based thing of let's stop doing written reports, we did not build in the capacity for the human beings to be able to take the notes, synthesize it, and do that. And so now I'm playing a little bit of catch up with that. But there has to be the infrastructure for this.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll get to that also. We'll unpack the structural requirements for being able to do this in a moment. But I thank you, Sarah. Coming back to you, Sherry from AJWS, we're already getting some questions about the context within which you fund, given that you're often working with partners that are literally in the middle of urgent humanitarian crises. So how do you navigate that against some of the kind of, the looking at these long-term indicators? How do you actually operationalize your approach to evaluation, given that you're funding in a global context across many issues and some real complex situations to boot?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I would really highlight 3 different levels or approaches that we take. And the first is, I'll go into a bit of detail, which is really about this idea of creating a learning system at AJWS. So, and this again is all done with our strategic learning research and evaluation unit. So our entire grant making system and the corresponding LM learning and evaluation system is done under like a feminist approach, and it's focused on strategic learning, which is the ongoing tracking of progress against outcomes to, and it spans from there to our external evaluation. So I'm going to talk a bit about both under this first heading of learning. So our internal system, we set 10-year goals in each of our strategies, 4-year outcomes and annual milestones for overall thematic and country strategies. And we pretty rigorously track those each year. Obviously, the 10-year goals, not each year. We track progress towards those 4-year outcomes each year. And we also have a policy and legislative tool that we use every year to assess how many pieces of policy and legislative work we're working on or contributing to, or our grantees are working on really around the world, and how that is all going. And we assess every few years the strength of the movements that we support through a social movements tool that was developed by our SLRE team in partnership with our programs team. And that looks at movements according to 20 indicators around base structure and strategy. And we're also now working with movements in the field to adapt that tool to be more useful to them, to help them think about and diagnose the strengths and challenges of their own movements. So once that data is captured by staff, our goal really is to feed all of it back to staff and managers on the ground who are involved in what are really accessible learning formats. So bubble charts and individual reports at the country and thematic level, so folks can really see reflected on paper from the data that they've all put in the system, what it all means and how we're doing against these outcomes, which are all really informed by conversations with our grantee partners on the ground. And we create these, like my colleagues are talking about, very intentional spaces. Every quarter at the thematic level, we have regional retreats. We bring our team together in a community week once a year, where we also do a lot of that learning and reflecting and course correcting as needed. And of course, this learning is also embedded in just management relationships. And because so much of the relationships that are held with our grantees are done by those folks from the ground, out of the movements that we're supporting, it's really an iterative process of learning from the data, bringing it back to the movements, having the movements inform what we're doing, adjusting what we're doing based on what we're hearing, and then trying to capture those into some kind of system so that at the overall level, we can understand it as it's monitoring, but it's not monitoring our grantees, it's monitoring ourselves. It's monitoring what we said we think we want to achieve based on what we're hearing the movements we're supporting want to see and believe is possible to happen. And I love that folks have talked about the nonlinear aspect of this, because it is almost always 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. It's an exercise in patience. I do want to talk about our external evaluation work, which is done about every 4 or 5 years at the overall programmatic level. And the way we think about learning in this way is that we're intentional about the planning of those, the implementation of those exercises, and the utilization of those. And as a result, for example, we did a meta evaluation of all of our programmatic work about 5 years ago. Out of it were some learnings for us about things that we could do better. So what we did is we sat with our SLRE team and we said, okay, what are the actions that we need to take up as a result from what we're learning here? We assigned owners, we met quarterly, we discussed progress and success and where we weren't making progress, and made some decisions about how to move forward. In terms of our sort of feminist approach, we're also building, where we can, very participatory processes working with our grantee partners. For example, in the Dominican Republic right now, we have an evaluation to learn more about our adolescent girls and young women's work there. So we've built the scope to actually sit with partners and get from them a sense of what they want to learn, so that we can build into our evaluation there some data and information that can be useful to them and not only to us. On our early and child marriage work, for example, in India, we drafted a brief from our midterm findings of that 10-year investment and translated it into a local language. So the brief not only talked about what we learned, but how AJWS was going to be using that information in the development of our strategy. And we're able to get feedback from our grantees about the wisdom of that strategy. So that's all under the bucket of learning and creating a learning culture. The second thing I would bring up, and I know this has been talked about by both Sarah and Brenda, is that like my colleagues, the burden of data gathering is really on our team. I hope that that's coming across in what I'm talking about. So we do outcome monitoring forums annually, which is where we capture this information. That is all done by our staff, and our learning and evaluation tools are also filled out by our team, and with the overall goal of really minimizing the burden on our grantees. And lastly, I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I think so critical to our trust-based approach is the accompaniment model. And this is the center really of our commitment to strong relationships, which are talked about so much in the literature. These 31 in-country colleagues that are hired out of the movements we support, their job is to provide resources, connections, engagement, mutual learning with grantee partners and local allies. And in partnership with our grantees, these field leaders can guide our grant making and strategy development and take in the learning and feed it back into the front lines. So since they are on the front lines, they are so critical to our on the ground due diligence processes, and they're able to complement what is really very brief written formats that we're also asking grantees to submit to us. So that's the system.
Ooh, wow. Sherry, one thing I didn't get a chance to ask, but I want to know for our listeners and participants today, AJWS didn't always have this accompaniment, trust-based approach to learning and evaluation. Can you tell us a little bit about what that transition may have looked like? Because I believe it used to be more conventional, and you kind of made your team made this shift over time. What did that process of change look like?
Yeah. So about 10 years ago, AJWS made the decision to have a strategic learning research and evaluation unit. Again, an independent unit that is separate from programs. And also we decided collectively the importance of this work of learning, monitoring, and evaluation, and working with our grantee partners and staff to set these outcomes. I would say before that work, we were all much more focused on a grantee by grantee look, gaining as much information as we could from grantee partners. I would say we were less focused on ecosystems of grantees and constellations of grants and movement support, so supporting different levels of organizations to support movements in country, and much more about a bit of like more of a thousand flowers bloom approach. So that meant that evaluation really needed to be rooted in each individual grantee. We also had a very engaged board who we were only giving grants twice a year, and the board would scrutinize every single grant that we were giving based on very long write-ups that the programs division would produce for them. So I think that we've had quite a revolution and evolution in both our learning, monitoring, evaluation work, really led by this independent strategic learning research and evaluation area, and also quite a revolution in our grants management system. So I'm going to talk a bit about it later, but we are giving grants much more often. We're much more responsive and much more flexible. So I think it's really the combination of both of those things, and a transformation on the board, which I know we're going to talk a bit more about later, in their trust of us, which has enabled the implementation of this new approach.
Brilliant. Gosh, don't you wish we had like 2 more hours to talk about all this stuff? Let's get into what you're talking about, Sherry, because I think all 3 of you have alluded to this in one way or another. Some of the internal work and infrastructural work. What does this mean? What do we need to consider in order to make the conditions conducive to trust-based learning and evaluation? Sherry, since you were just talking a little bit about this, I want to make a little bit more space for you to share, what internal structural things have made it possible for AJWS to pursue this type of this approach.
Thanks so much, Shadi. So I just brought up the grants management system, and anyone on the call who is a grant maker, either in a private foundation or a public charity, a family foundation, whatever it is, the grants management function is so absolutely critical to our success in providing the structure to be able to engage in this way. So I'm going to start there. So our reporting forms, for example, are really simple and accessible to grantees, no matter where they are or how grassroots they are. And they're available in 4 different languages. We are really flexible in how we gather that data. If it is impossible for them, for whatever reason, to write it up themselves, we certainly provide that support. This function within AJWS, I've been talking about a lot lately, is much more political than it's ever been. We try as much as we can to be as responsive as we can, because as we know, the context for the work we are doing, as you mentioned, is getting worse all the time. So at this point, AJWS is able to make grants to the field within 48 hours. We're no longer giving grants in 2 cycles, so grantees have to wait 6 months to get their money. We give grants every 2 months. And in an emergency, we can get money to the field as soon as 48 hours. We're also really flexible. So in COVID, I think that was like a real challenge to all of us in the field about how we were going to rise to that occasion. And we employed quite flexible mechanisms for partnering with our grantees. And I'm really pleased to say that not one of our grantee partners went under during the COVID crisis. Again, as we spoke about before, this is not only because of AJWS, but we really did take an approach that supported their sustainability through that crisis. We're willing to take risks, because we really do understand as a human rights funder that those on the front lines of change are really the ones taking the most risk. And an interesting indicator that's distressing, but is really undergirding why we have to do this work, is that in 8 of the 17 countries where we're funding now, we actually are needing to do more creative ways of getting money to the ground than we had ever done before. So this is really, really important work for us. So that's on the grants management. And on the second level, I would say that, like all things, alignment and trust really flows downstream. So, the TBP materials talk a lot about the values and structural alignment that is key in setting up these trust-based approaches. So firstly, AJWS, I would say, has a really strong alignment between the research and evaluation unit and the programs team. So the majority of our work is done in deep partnership, including the development of some of our tools. That said, they are separate and objective outside of the programs division, which I think is interesting and important. Secondly, is that we really do feel the trust from our senior leadership and our board. So at AJWS, program staff are making all of the grant making decisions. This wasn't the case even 4 years ago. So the vast majority really of those decisions are made by our in-country colleagues who are the closest to the ground. And our board and CEO are obviously, all folks in the executive team are given copies and thorough write-ups of all of our grants, but the decisions about who is funded and how they are funded is really comes from the program's leadership. So that level of trust that's given to programs, I think, really enables us to feel freer to trust our on-the-ground colleagues and also our grantee partners. And in turn, they trust us more, which obviously this trust is not one way.
That's exactly right. Thank you for lifting that up. And this goes back to that graphic that Shantias shared earlier on, the 4 dimensions framework, where a trust-based approach is really applying values at a culture, structures, leadership, and practice level. So you've really highlighted some of that. Brenda, I want to come back to you because you've already mentioned that learning is built into the culture of your organization. You talked about how it's, you build budget lines for it. It's written in people's job descriptions. You've also spoken a lot about the importance of a culture of trust internally. So can you share with us a little bit about kind of how to operationalize that kind of culture of trust that makes trust-based learning and evaluation possible, along with some of the other structural insights I'm sure you have about knowledge management systems? So a lot, but I'm sure you'll answer it the way that you best see fit.
Yeah, I think I don't think we pay enough attention to culture and what does it mean to actually build a trusting culture in almost any segment of society, but definitely in my experience in philanthropy, we don't pay attention to that. And the trust that we talk about in trust-based philanthropy is connected to the notion of power sharing and power seeding, which I think is a really important thing to raise up in this conversation, is that if you operate under the paradigm of it's my money or our money, or we control the money, and therefore we get to define success, and therefore we get to make everybody jump through the hoops that we define, and then we tell the story to ourselves so that we feel good at the end of the day as a foundation or a staff person. Like, if that's your paradigm, then you're going to have a very different approach than if you have a trust-based culture in your organization, where the center is the community and the grantees, and they are in the position to define what are the challenges, what are the solutions, and how do you determine success. It is very different to have a board that doesn't review grants. So at our foundation, the board does not review most of our grants. Staff, just like Shari's team, staff gets to make those awards. That requires a lot of trust. And then it also requires trust from the community, right? Like, how do you actually operate in a way that you're seen as a trusted partner and not just as a funder? And I can tell you, in my first 20 years in philanthropy, no nonprofit was 100%, I don't think, transparent and honest with me about what the challenges were. I get to Headwaters and I've actually been called out individually, publicly, in ways that you would never imagine a funder to get called out, because our grantee partners actually have a relationship with us where they do feel like they can be honest and give us constructive feedback and not be in fear of getting penalized. So how do you build this culture of trust? You actually have to pay attention to building relationships and being transparent and sharing power. And that starts with the board, right? You got to get the board to be able to operate in this way. It starts with leadership. I have to be consistent with what I'm saying our values are around being a trust-based organization, and my staff have to experience it and feel it. They then have to do that with the grantees so that it's consistent from the board to me, to the staff, down to the grantees. That means that you have to spend time on the soft things that sometimes we don't prioritize. Relationship building. You know, our staff, I often tell them, you're not going to on-site visits. You're going to go have coffee, or in Montana, a beer with some of our grantees. You're going to have a conversation. You're going to talk about your children. You're going to talk about, you know, what they're doing, what their favorite thing is. And then eventually you'll have a conversation of what's happening in their work. So it's just a very different mindset. And one of my colleagues here at Headwaters often says, I don't know why you guys called it trust-based philanthropy. You should have called it common sense philanthropy, because it's common sense. People want to be treated with respect and want to be seen as equals. And if we all kind of did that in everything that we would be doing, we would not be in this power dynamic that has existed in philanthropy. So culture is a huge important part. Values is a huge important part, and paying attention to this is almost as important as all the operational things that you need to put in place in order to make this happen. And then, yes, you know, we've had to change grants management systems. I don't know if you are aware, but the grant management companies that have been built around the power dynamic of the foundation in control and the grantees having to submit information. So if you build a system that is built to do that, then that's what you're going to get, as opposed to radically shifting your knowledge management system to be a tool that your staff uses to input information. And by the way, I've been talking about being unapologetic about using qualitative information, that you have to make those changes in the infrastructure and the systems that you have in order to actually operationalize this differently. And then you have to be open to making mistakes and learning. You know, we have modified our learning work so much from when we started. We had this vision of doing it differently. We've had hard lessons learned, but because we are a learning organization, we've incorporated those learnings and have improved things. And we don't have it all figured out. We like I've been talking in the chat, we're still trying to figure out how to actively engage grantees and making sense of all of this and using this. So there's a lot more work to be done on the part of Headwaters. And what I'm excited about in these conversations is that we're a group of peers that are all trying to figure this out. And the more that we can share about it and learn from each other, I think the more effective we will be, and hopefully transition the practice of learning in the field of philanthropy.
Yes. And I was just thinking about that, because I too, when I hear all three of you speaking, it really just reinforces the sense that all of this feels like common sense, but it isn't the norm in our sector yet. But the more of us who are out there advocating for these approaches, articulating the importance of it, demonstrating that this is actually more strategic and it involves patience and learning, and sometimes you don't always have the answers, and sometimes you have to try some things out. That's actually part of it, and let's just normalize that. So I really appreciate how all three of you have been articulating this and really, to me, making a quite a persuasive case for it. I want to get into a couple questions before we transition to breakouts. Acknowledging one, that there's actually some amazing insights and feedback happening in the chat from others who have their own experiences that they're eager to share. So thank you to all of you who are connecting and sharing emails and all those things to take some conversations offline. I hope you'll stick around for the breakouts. But I want to bring a few kind of like hot topic-y questions that sometimes come up. And one was in the chat. And I want to maybe bring this first to you, Sarah, and see if others have anything to share. It's a question about how to do this with limited staff. When you're a small organization, maybe one and a half staff members, can this be done? And the reason why I'm bringing this to Sarah Walczak is that it was only in the last several years that Satterberg has expanded its staff team. So maybe Sarah, you can share some insight on how you navigated some of these learning questions prior to building out the staff, or if you have any other advice for others who are operating solo, trying to embrace a learning culture.
Yeah, that
I mean, it has become, it is quite a challenge. We have 8 staff, like I said, and with 400 grantees, there's 5 people who are dedicated to managing those relationships. And when you have this idea of being a learning organization, and our board is very hungry to understand what these 400 organizations are experiencing, but we also have to take the time to build the trust to get the feedback from the grantees. And so I think early days when we were doing narrative reports, there is a way to ask for reflective questions that wouldn't maybe make someone feel they were in jeopardy of losing funding as much as that it's like a general reflection on philanthropy, or more of a broader net to extend on that. But I think the tools, and I feel like I've heard Brenda and others speak about this too, we realized quickly that we were asking grantees questions that folks have been saying for 50, 100 years. So a lot of the resources and time we've spent to be like, where are we most needed? What are grantees saying? Like even Trust-Based Philanthropy has a survey that we can pull from. Like the grantees have been asked where and how practice could change and where you're needed. And so figuring out how to use the resources that are already out there was one strategy we took. And then some of these casual conversations we've held regionally, where there are learning-based conversations where we're able to bring board and staff together with some grantee partners and maybe some regional partners and have a conversation about what's happening maybe in an LA area. And it was more of a learning opportunity where we were in dialogue, where Brenda was also talking to, where we're able to see our whole humanity, and we're also to engage in a lot of diversity of thought. And we have different practices and different people in the space kind of close sense making all of this together. And so it's easier to hold conversations with folks in a smaller setting than it is, constantly doing rigorous written reporting. But I think that appreciative inquiry, the kind of reflecting on it, a lot of that stuff already exists out there for smaller shops to be able to pull from. And then what Sherry was saying, reporting it back out to saying, is this what is known to be true for you now? Like you can do some of the sense making and reflection to put back out in the community and be transparent about it.
Thank you. And also just like a shout out for multi-year unrestricted funding, because that creates more spaciousness to, really understand those learnings over time. And that can be a real asset to understanding impact in a longer in the longer term. Sherry, I want to bring a question to you that I'm seeing in the chat about kind of improving the capacity of nonprofits to collect data. And I want to put a little asterisk on this question, because we've been talking about bringing the onus of kind of gathering data, putting that onus on the funder side. But of course, there needs to be some, sometimes you're listening and looking for opportunities to support partners that want to collect data. I'm curious how you approach that, given that you're working with grassroots organizations around the world. Maybe they're may not have the staff to, capture some things. How do you think about that at AJWS?
It's such a good question. And it is, when we did that meta-analysis that I was talking about several years ago of the overall programmatic area, there was some interest on the part of some grantee partners for us to help improve their evaluation work. And it's hard. We have a very small learning team, and it's hard for them to have the time and bandwidth to be able, we have a lot of grantees and probably a lot of need. I think there is a lot of work that is done by the folks on the ground who are accompanying our grantees. If they encounter a local grantee where they feel there's a lot of struggle around strategy development or thinking about what does success look like for them, they enter into strategic conversations about that. And I think even we often, especially with our most grassroots partners, the folks on the ground are sitting with those partners and helping them think about, could be their first proposal they've ever written to a grantee, to a funder. So how is it that you even conceptualize what it is you would want support for? So we do it at really, I think, that most basic level. We've, in our early and child marriage work, we worked with a local research institution in India called TIS. And there, the methodology that we were using was really about building that sense of learning and strategy and evaluation embedded into our grantee partners. It has been a portfolio that we had more staffing, more support. And so we were able to really get to that level of building individual grantee capacity. But I will say, you know, all of our tools are open source. So we make them available to our grantee partners as needed, and our on the ground staff do some of that work. But I would say it's not a place that we are systematically capable of really rising to the need that is out there for more support on this at the grantee level.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we're going to close out this panel with one final question to Brenda around boards, because boards often are, you know, the decision makers in approving some of these shifts. So what advice do you have for those who really want to figure out ways to bring these concepts to their boards? How can they bring their boards along on trust-based learning and evaluation?
I think it's really important to expose them to other ways of thinking about learning work. I have a very traditional board with all the typical, you know, players. There's a lawyer, there's a CPA, there's a doctor. They all hold the biases around what evaluation should look like and accountability. And so it required me giving them an opportunity to think about this differently, to explore what a paradigm shift might look like if you were to think about this work and flipping it in the way that we've been talking about it today. And it's been a journey, right? The first time we introduced this was not successful. It took about a year of us having conversations, exposing them to different ideas, bringing in other funders who are doing interesting ways of thinking about learning work, bringing them to conferences, whether it was GEO or CP, where you learn some interesting things about thinking about evaluation different. Because if you don't create an opportunity for them to even explore different paradigms, then they're just going to, you know, get stuck in where they have been. And so exposing them, educating them, and sharing how other foundations are doing and thinking about this is really an important thing. The other thing is you can't flip all of this overnight. So how do you think about doing one thing differently and demonstrating that it works, and then building off of that success? Because if you try to do it all over and all at one time and it doesn't work, then you're going to get the door shut on you. But if you take one thing and you make it work and it's successful, then I think there's going to be appetite and interest for thinking about this differently. And then I think it requires some boldness, right? Some really pushing against the paradigms that have existed. And I think many of us in philanthropy are sometimes a little too comfortable staying in the status quo and not pushing boards, not pushing leaders. And how do we become more bold and unapologetic in leading this work in different ways and exposing that to our trustees so that they can maybe consider something differently. And I'd love, Shadi, for someday for the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project to host something that's a trustee kind of session on this, because I think if we can all get, you know, some key trustees to come and listen and hear, and then maybe get some excitement and have them go back to your foundations, and talk to their other colleagues on the board, that I think that might get some traction in this field that's differently. And then if you could just humor me with one thing, there's one question that was asked that I think is really important to address in the chat, Shadi. And someone asked, can you share an example of where you actually shifted because of the learning approach that you have? And I want to share an example just because I want people to know that we're not just doing this for fun. We're doing it because we want to get better at what we do. So we, in our early childhood effort, had what basically is a collective impact kind of model. And in our work, we learned that there is not infrastructure in very rural parts of the state to have a collective impact model, because there isn't enough people to being in a collective impact model. So we actually shifted based on what we were hearing from our grantees in those communities. And we went from, you no longer have to be a collective impact model and have that in your community. We can actually think about different ways to fund early childhood efforts that are really meeting the community where it's at. I just wanted to share that so that you can see that it's not just to do it because we should do it, but because we are incorporating the learnings into our work.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that example. That's so important and instructive to lift up. Such a powerful note to conclude our panel discussion. Everyone, please join me in thanking Brenda Solorzano from the Headwaters Foundation, Sarah Walczak from the Satterberg Foundation, and Sherry Turretts from American Jewish World Service. You have brought so many powerful insights and stories to help us deepen our understanding of this. Thank you. I'm going to hand us back to Shantias Ford to transition us for our next set of activities. Take it away, Shantias.
Wow, thank you so much again to the panelists. That was absolutely amazing and insightful. And thank you for everybody for your audience engagement, seeing all of the questions and sharing of resources and information in the chat was wonderful to see. Yeah, let me move this notification out the way. So just really briefly, before we move on with anything, we of course want to have some key takeaways for us to think about and lift up as we move forward in this work. I mean, we could have 5 different slides on the key takeaways with all of these gems that were dropped, but it's important to remember, of course, that you can have a rigorous and thorough evaluation practice in a trust-based philanthropy approach. And I think all of our panelists did a great job of demonstrating what that looks like in their individual work. This approach really shifts that burden away from grantees having to prove their worth to funders taking on that onus of learning, documenting, and responding and being reflective. An internal culture of trust is important for that. It builds those better conditions for trust-based learning. And it's an opportunity, if it doesn't exist in your organization, to invest that time and effort to build it. Also, re-examining your operational infrastructure to better support those learning goals is a key takeaway for you all to have. And trust-based learning helps funders to be more strategic and effective. So those are just some of the key takeaways. I know there was a lot that we learned, but I do want to take a moment to do a quick closing poll now that you've had the opportunity to hear a little bit more regarding this question. How confident are you now that you can answer the question? What does evaluation look like in a trust-based context? You've got some great examples there from our different panelists, some great resources, connections, and I'm definitely seeing, for the most part, people are very confident or somewhat confident. Maybe you have an idea of the answer, you have more clarity, but there's still more to go, and this is just meant to be a starting point as we continue these conversations. So I'll end that poll and share the results. We have a 46-53 split for the most part, a very confident and somewhat confident. So thank you all so much for doing that. And now we're going to transition into our discussion portion of this. We are not done yet. We are going to have some time to discuss and reflect on what you've heard or what your next steps are, an opportunity just to connect with your peer funders and your philanthropy serving organizations that you may be a part of. My colleague is dropping the evaluation in the chat. Please, please, please take the time to complete that. That's so helpful for us as we're designing future programming for you all. And of course, the resources and recording will be shared out. And we encourage you to join us at our next session, our final session in the series, but there's more to come, which will be around racial equity, and that'll be on August 2nd. I'm going to put back up the slide for our philanthropy serving organization partners. If you're not, we're going to open up the breakouts. If you're not already in one, or if you're not invited to be in one, we'll support you in getting that out. But I will just pause for a second so we can stop the recording.